I'm from a tiny town in North Carolina. My experience with homeless people has essentially been limited to what I've seen on vacation. However, when I was in my junior year of college, this homeless hitchhiker was passing through town. I'd sometimes see him sitting on a narrow strip of pavement at the light with a cardboard sign asking for change. A couple of times I stopped and spoke with him. He seemed to be a genuinely sweet and caring person. Before you judge me for being too trusting, let me remind you that I was young and from that small town mindset, where everyone knew everyone. Although they were brief, I thought our conversations meant we were on good terms. Anyway, I stopped at the light one day, and the man approached my truck. He tapped on my window, and I rolled it down. The man seemed a little off that day, but I guess I just didn't think that much of it at the time. He told me he needed a ride to Walmart, and since I was heading in the same direction, I invited him to jump in the truck bed. About halfway there, the hitchhiker nonchalantly asked me to check my rearview mirror. I glanced up, and what I saw scared the crap out of me. The man had a small pistol aimed at me. It was well hidden in the sleeve of his oversized jacket. I'm sure that none of the passing vehicles would have seen it, not unless they were looking closely. My blood ran cold. I never would have thought he would have done something like this. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Don't do anything stupid." "Pull off at the next turn," he instructed. "No sudden movements, or else." I was nervous when he told me to pull onto a secluded back road, but I did as he said. What would happen after we were all alone? I was terrified. As soon as the main road was out of sight, he motioned me to pull over and get out of my vehicle. "Leave everything in the car," he ordered. "Your phone and wallet, too." I did as he said, moving slowly and carefully. After I'd placed the items in the seat, I turned towards the man with my hands up. "Good," he said. "Now, step away from the truck." With the gun still pointed at me, he climbed into the driver's seat of my truck. He had this cold look in his eye, and for a moment, I was sure he was going to shoot me. But then he just drove off. I was able to walk to a nearby gas station, where I promptly called the police. My truck was found totaled several weeks later in a completely different state. The homeless guy was never found. Ever since that day, I've been less trusting of those around me. I wish I felt comfortable enough to help out hitchhikers, but I don't. It scares me to think someone would do something like that, but you can never expect what a person's going to do when they're desperate. When I was about 13, my father and I drove through northern Arizona to visit my Uncle Walter. I don't know if you've ever been on any of these roads, but unless you're near a city or a town, it feels like it's just a vast expanse of flat brown. It's really rare to see other cars, let alone hitchhikers. But just after we stopped for lunch, my dad spotted a guy walking on the side of the road. I remember him wondering if he'd had car trouble. My dad decided to stop and ask him where he was going. The man said that he was going to the next town over. His name was Matthew Dillon, and he seemed normal enough at first. But I noticed there were some contradictions in what he told us. First, he said that his car had broken down, but he later claimed that he'd been walking because his car was in the shop. My dad was a very trusting man, and he didn't seem to notice the man's discrepancies. I thought about saying something, but it didn't feel right. I listened as my dad and Matthew continued to talk. They had a few conversations along the way. They didn't delve into any personal details, but my dad did mention that we were from Indiana and talked about a couple of the roadside attractions that we had visited. Matthew would comment on the radio or the scenery around us. He was only in our car for about an hour and a half before we reached the man's destination. My dad pulled off at a Wendy's and he let Matthew out. I got back in the front seat and we continued on our way. When we got to the town's border, there was a traffic stop. My dad sighed, saying he wished we would have gotten some food to eat while we were waiting, but he turned up the music. When we got to the front of the line, an officer tapped on the window and asked to see my dad's license. He looked at the license carefully and then handed it back to my dad. I thought we'd be given the okay to drive, but then the officer asked, "I don't suppose you two saw anyone walking along the highway on your way here?" As a matter of fact, my dad began, we did. He told the cop about Matthew Dillon. The officer took off his oversized sunglasses and told my dad to pull over to the side. "We need to search your car," he told us. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Matthew Dillon." I could see the sweat running down my dad's neck as he nervously asked what the man was wanted for. The officer said that Matthew was suspected of murder. My father went white as a ghost, complying with the search. Dad told me they wouldn't find anything, but the officer returned a short time later with a bagged syringe, asking if my father recognized it. He didn't. We were quickly escorted to the nearest hospital, where we had blood drawn. Apparently, Matthew's method of murder was poison, and since there was an empty syringe, they were worried we'd been injected without noticing. It was a terrifying situation, but fortunately we ended up being okay. Sometimes I wonder who Matthew actually did inject with that poison, and what became of them. This happened to Sarah, my former girlfriend, now wife, back when we were still in high school. She had a part-time job at a local grocery store while I worked at a restaurant across the city. Sometimes, if she had a long enough lunch break, she'd come over to where I worked, and we'd eat together. One day, Sarah showed up, obviously frazzled, and I asked her what was wrong. She told me about an encounter she'd had with a hitchhiker. She said a man, probably in his early 50s, was trying to hitch a ride on the road outside of her work. At first, Sarah was hesitant to stop, but then she remembered something her mom had told her. She was from a hippie family, and they instilled the value that one was always supposed to stop and help people stranded on the road, or homeless, or out of gas, or whatever. They believed that this would only lead to good conversation and good karma. So even though Sarah had passed the man in her indecision, she turned around and offered him a ride. He introduced himself, his name I can't remember, and neither can she, and was extremely grateful that my wife had stopped. He had a canvas bag full of groceries. The older man told Sarah that his meat would have likely spoiled in the hot California weather if she hadn't stopped. He asked to be dropped off at the post office, which was on the way to the restaurant. When Sarah drove away, he stopped talking and just stared at her. She said it was kind of creepy, but she tried to focus on the road. She turned the radio on to alleviate the awkwardness. After a bit more staring, he blurted out something about how pretty she was. He asked if he could take her out sometime. My wife was disgusted. She was pretty sure that this guy was older than her dad. Sarah said she firmly told him she was not interested and did not want to date him, but he kept asking about her relationship status. She felt really uncomfortable. Sarah asked him to stop, and he got angry. He started calling her all sorts of names, ones that rhyme with witch, hut, and door. He banged his fist against the side door and said she had to hear him out. Sarah steered into the nearest turn-in and slammed on the brakes. She said she could feel her face turning red as she screamed at him, yelling, "Get out of my car!" over and over until the man listened. He left in such a hurry that he forgot his groceries. My wife no longer stops for hitchhikers. I know that it bothers her mom, but the world just isn't one big music festival. There are a lot of bad, evil people in the world. If that man had been any more violent, things could have turned out much differently for Sarah.